For the occasion, I have the great pleasure to welcome Asuncion Fresnoza-Flot, who is a research associate at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. She has a PhD in sociology, and she has been working since 2004 on Filipino migration to Europe, with a focus on family and gender dimensions. And she has published extensively on the topic, and I want here to underline two important papers in that respect. The first is Migration Status and Transnational Mothering, the case of Filipino migrants in France, published in 2009. And the second is on transnational perspectives on intersecting experiences, gender, social class, and generation among Southeast Asian migrants and their families. For today, we asked her to give a quite big overview of gender issues in transnational migration studies, identify some recent developments, and try to have some perspective future. So thank you very much for having accepted our invitation here. And Janine Dahinden will discuss her presentation. She is, I think, the best person in the NCCR on the move to discuss her presentation, as she has been working extensively on the way migration and mobility intersect with the production of inequalities along gender lines, among others. And she will have, Asuncion will talk for about 50 minutes. Afterwards, Janine will discuss her paper for about 5 to 10 minutes, and we will open the floor for the remaining 30 minutes. Before I give the floor to Asuncion, I would like to inform you that this session is recorded and it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So if for whatever reason you don't want to appear on the video, I invite you to deactivate your camera and ask your question in the chat function. Now, Asuncion, your paper is entitled Gender Gaps in Transnational Migration Studies, Recent Developments and Prospects, and I very much look forward to listening to you. You can go ahead.
Thank you so much, Robin. I would like to thank first my colleagues of the Neuchâtel Graduate Conference for inviting me here today. It is an honor and a great pleasure for me to take part in this conference that gathers young researchers from different countries in the world, my colleagues from the NCCR on the move, and also scholars working on migration and mobility. So to address gender issues in transnational migration studies and identify future avenues to further develop this research field, I will draw from my many years of experience in transnational migration research, particularly on three recent reviews of the migration literature. Since the early 1990s, cross-national border movements of people have been widely examined through the lens of transnationalism, introduced in the early 1990s by Linda Basch, Nina Glick-Schiller, and Christina Santon-Blanc, specifically in their book, Nations Unbound, Transnational Projects, Postcolonial Predicaments, and the Territorialized Nation States. Through their works, we came to understand transnationalism as a process of construction, reconstruction, maintenance, and reinforcement of various social ties of people, linking their societies of residence, societies of origin, and other countries. So migratory movements examined through this lens are called transnational migrations. And within this specific research field, gender as an analytical lens has allowed scholars to deconstruct and unmask relations of power among different social groups, individuals, and also institutions. More than 4 decades after feminist scholars introduced gender perspectives in transnational migration scholarship, what is the present state of this research field? Are there remaining gender gaps to address? How do we further advance transnational migration studies? So in this presentation, I define gender gaps in specific epistemologies as lacunas in terms of the extent to which scholarly focus, methodologies, and analysis are gender inclusive, gender informed, or gender oriented. So in this context, gender means not only a socially constructed category, but also a viewpoint focalizing on power dynamics, relations, and asymmetries among social groups. Inquiring into the existing gender gaps in transnational migration studies require prior awareness of contemporary developments of cross-national border movements of people. Based on the latest data of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the number of migrant men continues to exceed that of migrant women, 52% versus 48% of the 281 million migrants recorded in 2020. So this raises many questions. For example, does the numerical dominance of migrant men translate into comparatively more studies about them compared to research focusing on migrant women? So I go to my next slide. So this one. So prior to the birth of the gender and the migration scholarship, the broader field of migration studies displayed several shortcomings related to gender, as we can see in this slide. First, there was a male bias that viewed migration as purely men's enterprise. Second, scholars mostly adopted what Mirjana Murukbachik in her pioneering article calls a reductionist perspective, a view that considered women as mere followers and dependents to men. Third, scholars approached migration in a gender-neutral way, and this gender blindness did not pay attention to the power dynamics and gender processes involved in migration. Fourth, as a result of these approaches, women migrants were mostly invisible in the study of migratory phenomena. And fifth, there was also a heterosexual bias linked to the heteronormative tendency in migration studies to analyze migration as strictly a heterosexual affair, neglecting the idea that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer individuals are also capable of migrating. Now that gender perspectives have already permeated migration studies, we can expect that radical changes have taken place in the way scholars in the field conduct their investigations. Is this really the case? So for this presentation, I will draw first from my recent published review of the migration literature associated with the so-called social reproduction. And I believe that this can provide us some insights to identify the gender gaps in transnational migration scholarship. So drawing from the works of Eleanor Kaufman and Parvati Raghuram, the term social reproduction refers in my presentation to the maintenance of human beings' biological and social existence in everyday life and across generations, which takes place within households, family units, and other social institutions. The three bodies of work I decorticated in my review focus respectively on labor migration, marriage migration, and migration towards bioreproduction. Michal Naman calls the latter repromigration, that is, national border crossing oriented towards reproductive practices of intended parents, for example, fertility and maternity migrations, and is connected to other forms of global mobilities and immobilities. So it is important to take note that the boundaries among these three migration patterns are blurred, as the migration of an individual may display successively characteristics supposedly associated with one or the other of these patterns. So my review of these bodies of works uncover gender gaps in the field. At the empirical level, the experiences of LGBTQ migrants remain largely neglected in studies on transnational migrations. As Nathaniel Lewis and Susan Mills in their 2016 article about gay labor migration remark, gay men who fall outside the heteronormative conceptions of gender are most often, open quote, absent from discussions of social reproduction, close quote, which is also the case of other LGBTQ migrants. At the analytical level, heteronormative interpretations of migrants' experiences thrive in the field, resulting in a neglect of the sexual dimension of migration. So keeping in mind these two gender gaps I identified in the literature on transnational migrations associated with social reproduction, I carried out a second review focusing on the corpus of works on gender and migration and on the larger body of studies on transnational migration. This review is my contribution to the forthcoming volume entitled Gender Equality in the Mirror, Reflecting on Power, Participation, and Global Justice, edited by Elisa Fornale. In this paper, I combined a qualitative analysis of gender and migration literature with a quantitative review or bibliometric analysis of the broader migration literature between 1980 and 2019 using two search engines that are widely used in research and academia, Web of Science and Google Scholar, as well as the websites of two of the leading journals in the field, Gender, Place, and Culture and Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. By adopting a mixed methodological approach, I aim to facilitate an in-depth understanding of the significant developments in transnational migration studies and of the place of gender within this scholarship. I also intended to offer fresh insights on which areas of the field should further strive to become more gender sensitive. I am aware that my review of the transnational migration literature poses certain limitations. First, it has linguistic bias, as I mainly concentrated on works written in English. Second, my review's focus on gender gaps leaves out issues related to other categories such as ethnicity, age, and social class. And third, my review draws from only two widely used search engines, which overlooks less popular and independent platforms at national, regional, or international levels. However, despite these limitations, I believe that the results I obtained from my review can contribute to migration scholars' ongoing reflections on how we can further develop this research field of transnational migration studies, notably gender and migration scholarship. My qualitative analysis of this specific scholarship in different social contexts shows that there have been advancements in the field which have been taking place in various spaces, but in a non-uniform fashion. Like in previous qualitative reviews of gender and migration scholarship, I observed that US and Europe are almost at the same stage of progress in empirical and theoretical terms. The first stage of gender and migration research started in the 1970s in both regions. The rise of queer migration studies is an important recent development there. In the US, for example, sociologist Pierrette Hondaño-Sotelo remarked in her 2011 review of gender and migration scholarship that sexuality has become one of the mainstreams in this research field, thanks to the early initiatives of US-based migration scholars, such as Lionel Cantu, Hector Carrillo, Ethne Lubheid, and Martin Manalansan, as we can see in this slide. These scholars emphasized in their early works the importance of the queer perspective and sexuality in migration research. The queer perspective, according to Martin Manalansan in his seminal article in 2006 entitled Queer Intersections, I quote here, suggests that sexuality is disciplined by social institutions and practices that normalize and naturalize heterosexuality and heterosexual practices, including marriage, family, and biological reproduction, by marginalizing persons, institutions, or practices that deviate from these norms. In Europe, after what Christine Catarino and Mirjana Morokbaci call the compensatory pace of gender and migration research, that is, open quote, focusing on women, showing them where they were not visible, close quote. The second stage of this research field occurred from the 1990s to the 2000s, during which the globalization, intersectionality, and transnationalism perspectives permeated European migration scholarship. It was during this period that studies on international division of reproductive labor, domestic or care work, skilled migration, and transnational families mushroomed in Europe. We can see some examples of these works in this slide. I also contributed to this literature through my works on Filipino migrant mothers in France and their transnational families. The scholarly focus on women migrants unintentionally overlook the case of migrant men and LGBTQ migrants in Europe. During the third stage of gender and migration research from the 2010 to present, migration scholars in the region have been rectifying these shortcomings in several ways. For example, examining men's experiences, migrant men's experiences, carrying out more gender-informed, transnational and or intersectional research concentrating on power relations and inequalities, and moving beyond care analysis to examine rising phenomena in the region, such as family and marriage, refugee, and LGBTQ migrations. Despite the developments of gender and migration research in the US and Europe, the metaphor of a glass half full, quote unquote, remains applicable due to the compartmentalized, open quote, nature of social science, close quote, in which, in the words of American sociologist Pierre Tondaño Sotelo, open quote, researchers are mostly not in conversation with one another, close quote. The immediate need is therefore to diversify gender and migration research by incorporating interdisciplinary perspectives. In other regions, male-focused and gender-neutral migration studies preceded the slow emergence of the gender and migration scholarship. There are also advancements in gender and migration research in empirical terms. However, there are remaining issues to address. Gioconda Herrera, in her 2012 review of the state of gender and migration scholarship in Latin America, remarks that, I quote here, migrations are analyzed as individual male trajectories articulated to family strategies in which women, gender relations, and generational differences are taken as neutral variables. Aside from this gender gap, other remaining issues that are not addressed yet in Latin American migration, according to her, includes trafficking, the relationship among gender, state, and migration policies and sexualities, notably migratory experiences of, open quote, transsexual, transgender, gay, and lesbian people, close quote. In Asia, there is still a need for more theorizations that go beyond the European and US perspectives on migration. Africa, on the other hand, underwent a long period of visibilization of women in migration research compared to other regions in the world, which has resulted in growing separate scholarships, respectively focused on women and men. Making this scholarship converge will require more studies adapting gender perspectives in the continent. And finally, sexuality and queer perspectives have not yet receiving much attention in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, a gender gap that can be attributed to the challenging social legal situations of LGBTQ individuals in these regions. Let us now turn to the results of my quantitative review of the migration literature and find out if the findings of my qualitative analysis reflect the tendencies in this broader research field. I present the 6 major developments I identified in my bibliometric analysis. The first one concerns visibilized women and feminized gender. So when searching for the word combinations, gender, women, migration, and gender, men, migration in the title, abstract, and keywords of publications during the period 1980 to 2019, Web of Science showed 3,287 scholarly works for the former and 1,462 for the latter. Similarly, Google Scholar displayed more published works on gender, women in migration than works on gender, men, and migration. Interestingly, the 2009 period was the peak of published studies with the words gender, women, and migration in the title, which coincided with the development of gender and migration research, particularly in the US and Europe. From 2010 to 2019, the number of studies on the same theme dropped by 22%, from 208 to 162. By contrast, the works with the keywords gender, men, and migration in the title registered a slow increase from 5 during the period 1990 to 1998 to 18 during the period 2010-2019. So this suggests that the tendency of studying women's migration through the lens of gender does not always apply to men's migration. Although gender is relational and experiential, gender remains often connotated with women and vice versa. In terms of disciplines and research areas, Web of Science indicated that studies with the topic women, gender, and migration were mainly carried out in women's studies, demography, sociology, and geography. We could see here, because there is also anthropology and area studies, like, for example, Asian studies. The research field of women's studies disappeared in the results when looking for works with men, gender, and migration that were usually conducted in demography, sociology, geography, and public, environmental, and occupational health. I think I missed one slide. So yeah, so this is about men, gender, and migration. So here we could not find anymore this field of women's studies, yeah, that we can find on the other slide. So the top 5 journals publishing studies on both topics, meaning gender, women, migration, men, gender, and migration, were inscribed in one or more of the disciplines and research areas I just mentioned. The following journals were leading in terms of published works on these 2 topics. So the first one is Gender, Place, and Culture, then Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, Women's Studies International Forum, International Migration Review. So except for Women's Studies International Forum, the one encircled in red, all these top journals also publish works on men, gender, and migration. Among these journals, Gender, Place, and Culture and Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies ranked first and second, respectively, for both set of works, confirming that women are no longer invisible in migration studies. So in Gender, Place, and Culture journal, there were more articles published from 1994 to 2019 with the keywords women in migration in the title, than with men and migration in the titles, 22 versus 5. This was also the case for the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies with 74 works with women in migration in the title, and published from 1971 to 2019 versus 6 on men. Based on the reprint address or the country of the corresponding author of each published works, the regions that dominated migration studies in terms of research outputs were North America, with US at the top of the list, and European countries such as England and Germany. Australia was also among the top 10 countries in Web of Science, whereas the People's Republic of China was the only Asian country that made it to the top 10. Latin American and African countries were not yet among the top 10 countries. Yeah, this is also the case when I look, for example, for the keywords men, gender, and migration, and we could see that China is the only Asian countries in the list. This suggests that it is not only social science that is compartmentalized, but also the politico-geographic regions in which migration research takes place. It echoes the results of my qualitative review showing that US and Europe are ahead of the developments in gender and migration research. It also illustrates the social inequalities migration scholars identified between the so-called global North and global South, as well as between visible women, quote unquote, in the former and their invisible counterparts in the latter. Migration studies reflects these inequalities in knowledge production, which calls for more collaborative research projects and exchanges among countries in these regions to progressively fill this current gap in migration studies. The second development in transnational migration studies that I identified in my review is the slowly increasing consideration of sexuality and LGBTQ migrants. So Web of Science shows that studies with the words gender, sexuality, and migration in the title remain marginal in the broader migration scholarship, with only 10 publications in total. You can see that in this graph, from 1980 to 2019. Likewise, there were only 11 works with the words men and sexuality and migration in the title during the same period. Google Scholar had 23 works in total with the same keywords, gender, sexuality, and migration in the title, and identified that the first work with the keywords men, sexuality, and migration in the title appeared in 1999. So that is the work of Lionel Cantu's doctoral dissertation on border crossings, Mexican men, and the sexuality of migration. As scholars started to examine sexualities in migration, interest in the case of LGBTQ migrants also increased, but in a slow pace at the beginning before intensifying from 2010 onwards, as this graph shows. Web of Science retrieved only 24 works with LGBT migrants in the title, abstract and keywords from the late 2000s to 2019. One of these works appeared in 2007 following the publication of Manalansan's article, and the rest emerged during the 2010-2019 period. When the search for the keywords LGBT migrants and LGBTQ migrants was specified as a topic and not as a title, meaning as a phrase appearing in the title, abstract, and keywords of a paper, Web of Science showed 24 publications for the former and 18 for the latter. So most of these studies were published during the 2010-2019 period. Google Scholars also showed the same trend. What is evident is that both search engines unveiled more studies before 2010, including LGBT and migration as keywords in any parts of their text than LGBTQ and migration. Since 2010, sexuality and LGBTQ migrants have been increasingly considered in the analysis of migration, but generally remain marginal when compared to the bulk of publications on heterosexual migrants. As I observed in my previous review on transnational migration associated with social reproduction, LGBTQ migrants remain largely neglected in studies on transnational migrations. Nonetheless, if the scholarly interest in sexuality and LGBTQ migrants continues in the upcoming decade, LGBTQ migration through the prism of sexuality and queer perspectives will occupy a central place in broader migration studies, similar to what happened with women's migratory movements. The third development I identified in my quantitative review of transnational migration scholarship is the continued transnationalization of this field, meaning to say it is the process in which many migration scholars continue to adopt the lens of transnationalism in their studies. So Web of Science and Google Scholar provide quantitative proofs of this continued transnationalization of migration studies. For example, this graph shows that from 1990 to 2019, there were 130 publications in total in Web of Science with the words transnationalism and migration in their title. When the search incorporated gender in the keywords, transnationalism, migration, and look only at the title of publications, the result was a small number of works, 9 publications. However, Web of Science returned 224 results when the search covered the title, abstract, and keywords of publications. Since 1990, these works have been steadily increasing in citation number. In Google Scholar, the number of publications bearing the keywords transnationalism and migration was also in constant augmentation. For example, from 53 publications during 1990-2000 period to 217 publications during 2011-2019 period. However, a search for the words gender, transnationalism, and migration in the title of publications during the 1990-2019 period gave only 17 results and 0 during the period 1980-1989. So the crossing of data obtained from these two search engines confirms the lingering scholarly tendency to study migration using a transnational perspective. Interestingly, gender appears often out of the main focus, which is surprising given the widely known studies on transnational families, care, and social reproduction. And I think this requires qualitative investigations. The fourth development I observed in my review regarding transnational migration studies is the rising intersectionality approach and the prevailing mobility lens. Kimberly Crenshaw introduces the intersectionality approach in her 1989 article. This approach examines how the imbrication of different of what she calls categories of difference, such as gender, age, race, etc., produces and reinforces marginality and oppression of social minorities, notably Black women. Although it was initially applied to the study of these minority women, its influence has been progressively observed in migration studies in recent years. Likewise, the spatial turn in the social sciences lead to the rise of mobility approach to migration, notably in geography, sociology, and anthropology. According to Peter Adey and colleagues in the Routledge Handbook of Mobilities, mobility refers to, I quote here, a set of highly meaningful social practices that make up social, cultural, and political life. It is a change of condition, in the words of Bert Kanzler and colleagues in their book, Tracing Mobilities. Jan Urey identifies in 2004 the 5 interrelated forms of mobility that we could see in this slide. Transnational migration involves these forms of mobility, notably the corporeal travel of people. The influence of mobility, of the mobility lens in migration studies in quantitative terms surged more than that of intersectionality and transnational approaches. So this graph compares the number of publications bearing the following words in the title during a search in Google Scholar: transnationalism migration, mobility migration, and intersectionality migration. So it clearly shows that whereas the transnationalization of migration studies continues and the intersectionality approach is on the rise, the mobility perspective retains its dominant influence in the field. This dominance is probably due to the polyvalence of the mobility concept. Scholars in different research fields and disciplines are applying this concept in their inquiries, as well as fuse it or combine it with other perspectives and approaches, such as transnationalism and intersectionality. One example is the special issue entitled Mobilities Intersections in the journal Mobilities in 2016. So this tendency also develops alongside some migration scholars' simultaneous adoption of transnationalism and intersectionality approaches in the analysis, like, for example, the special issue Transnational Perspectives on Intersecting Experiences edited by Kyoko Senosaki and I in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies in 2017, and also the 2018 book Gender and Migration, Transnational and Intersectional Prospects by Anna Amelina and Helma Lutz. What is interesting is that these 3 analytical lenses, transnationalism, mobility, and intersectionality, reinforce the value of qualitative approach to migration studies. For example, in Web of Science, when we do research for articles, for example, with keywords gender, qualitative, and migration, Web of Science showed 523 publications, more publications than those with the keywords gender, quantitative, and migration in the same research areas. So the influence of the mobility perspective in migration studies grows alongside the publication of many articles on mobility on international peer-reviewed journals and the creation of the journal Mobilities, as well as the Berghahn Worlds in Motion series. So the Journal of Mobilities and Berghahn Worlds in Motion series have already published several studies on mobility and migration with often a gender perspective. So here are some examples of the books published in Berghahn. And two of these examples, like women migrants from east to west and intimate mobilities, take into account a gender perspective. I now present the fifth development I identified in my review of migration literature. I describe it as the diversification of research focus in the field of transnational migration studies. So scholars are exploring new terrains of inquiry as migratory movements intensify. These terrains include superdiversity in global cities in the world, migration of displaced people, and family-related migration. So superdiversity, in the words of Steven Bartovek, takes place when various categories of difference, such as religion, social class, ethnicity, nationality, intricately intersect at different facets of social life. The decline of multiculturalism has led to the rising popularity of the superdiversity concept among migration scholars, notably in Europe. Several publications using it as an analytical lens have unveiled the heuristic value of this concept. However, this burgeoning research field has still many gaps to address. For example, Nancy Foner, Jan Willem Duivendak, and Philip Kassenitz, in their 2019 introduction to the special issue, Superdiversity in Everyday Life in Ethnic and Racial Studies, remarked that this field has excluded in its analysis the dimension of power and has utilized an ethnofocal lens. At the time of my quantitative analysis of the migration literature, there were 239 works in Google Scholar with superdiversity term in the title, but not even one included gender. Since a gender perspective considers power dynamics and processes, incorporating it in the analysis of superdiversity would be an effective solution to address the gaps pinpointed by migration scholars. Another recent phenomenon that has been attracting scholarly attention, notably in Europe, is the one involving asylum seekers and displaced people from war-torn and or poverty-stricken countries in the Middle East and Africa. Since 2010, studies on migrant refugees have been increasing. Google Scholar, for example, showed 187 publications on the topic between 2000 and 2019, whereas Web of Science unveiled 446 works. The latter search engine indicates that these works were mostly authored by scholars from major countries receiving displaced people, namely the US, England, Australia, Germany, Canada, Netherlands, Turkey, Italy, Sweden, and Switzerland. There are still only few publications bearing the keywords gender, refugees, migration in their title, only 5 from 2000 to 2019. So this observation suggests the need to engender the analysis of displaced people's movement. Finally, the migratory wave that has intensified for the last years and has attracted scholarly interest is related to families, notably migration by and or for marriage, or marriage migration in short, leading to the formation of mixed couples, quote unquote, with different nationalities and or ethnicities as defined by Betty Duhart and colleagues in their article, Law in the Everyday Lives of Transnational Families. Web of Science had 197 publications with marriage and migration in the title during the period 2000 and 2019. So aside from several articles and monographs, edited volumes and special issues related to this topic mushroomed during the second decade of the 21st century. Here are some of the most recent works in this field. This year alone, 3 special issues were published, as we can see in the central part of this slide. More and more works examine migration through the prism of intimacy and mobility. However, among the 197 publications identified in Web of Science, only 16 of them bore gender in the title. There was not yet any works with, for example, LGBTQ, marriage, and migration in the title. So these 2 aspects represent a gap in this research field of marriage and migration. Another significant development in transnational migration studies is its unabated expansion beyond the borders of its core disciplines, namely demography, history, geography, sociology, anthropology, economics, and political science. This development can be mainly observed in theology and biology. Web of Science and Google Scholars provide quantitative data showing the extent of this growth. In theology, reflections on human migration can be traced back as early as the 1960s, during which the first initiatives took place. Gioacchino Campese, in his 2012 article in the journal Theological Studies, wrote that these initiatives comprise the organization of, open quote, national and international theological conferences, close quote, and the publication of the, open quote again, writings of some Scalabrinian missionaries, close quote, in Rome. So on the website of these missionaries, we can find that they founded centers for migration studies in 7 cities in the world to gain a deeper understanding of migration in all its aspects. So these cities are New York, Paris, Rome, Cape Town, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, and Manila. So it was in the late 1970s in the US when the first attempts to craft a theology of migration happened. So during the first decade of the 21st century, several theological gatherings and publications took place. In 2008, Daniel Grudi and Gioacchino Campese proposed a theology of immigration in their book, A Promised Land, A Perilous Journey. The following years witnessed the publication of several books and articles, notably in the journal Theological Studies. Since its beginning, theology of migration promotes interdisciplinarity, drawing from these different disciplines of migration. It is not surprising that the Centers for Migration Studies that Scalabrinian missionaries founded are the home of some of the leading journals in the broader field of migration studies, such as International Migration Review and the Asian and Pacific Migration Journal. Quantitatively speaking, during the span of 4 decades, that is from 1980 to 2019, Web of Science and Google scholars identified the second decade of the 21st century as the period with the highest number of publications, with Theology and Migration in the title 37 and 83 respectively. The second decade of the 21st century marks therefore the sharp takeoff of the theology of migration. This development coincided with the surge of scholarly interest in religion in the broader field of migration studies. As Google Scholar unveils, such increase started in the 1990-1999 period with 69 publications bearing the keywords religion and migration in the title. This number more than doubled in the period between 2000 and 2009, but the peak happened in the period 2010 to 2019 with 389 publications, as this graph shows, which Web of Science confirmed. During the same period, 6 publications appeared with the words gender, religion, and migration in the title. However, there is not yet any publications with gender, theology, and migration in the title on Web of Science, which indicates a critical gap to address in the theological study of migration. Sorry. In biology, since the 2000s, the research field of genetics has been contributing new findings regarding migration by analyzing human DNA. This process involves examining the Y chromosome that fathers pass to their male children and or the mitochondrial DNA that mothers transfer to both their male and female children. Studies employing these methods provide fresh knowledge on human mobility across time and geographical spaces. For example, mitochondrial DNA analysis showed that the early waves of human migration occurred first within Africa, specifically from the region that Vanessa Hayes and colleagues call in their 2019 Nature paper, Mak-Gadik-Gadi in Southern Africa, before proceeding to different continents of the world. You could see this region here in the map in this slide. So like theology of migration, the genetic study of human mobility promotes interdisciplinarity. Scholars in this field integrate and draw from various disciplines such as anthropology, archaeology, paleoclimatology, and even linguistics to obtain evidence corroborating their DNA analysis. So because of this, scholars were able to trace the complexities and multiple flows of early migration, as we can see in this map. This is based on mitochondrial DNA analysis. It's very complex map. In his recent work entitled Who We Are and How We Get Here, geneticist David Rice emphasizes and demonstrates the value of ancient human DNA analysis in the study of human mobility. Studies using this method contribute to breaking or putting into question racializing stereotypes and discourses regarding majority and minority populations in society. They also help us understand power inequalities in the past that left genetic imprints on the present-day human population. For example, David Rice discusses in his book how the analysis of Y chromosome can identify star clusters, quote unquote, in which a population of men sharing a common male ancestor is spread across many countries and across generations. This analytical approach can unveil the past migration of the descendants of a single man and may shed light on gender inequalities in terms of spatial movements. Nevertheless, this research field appears to be taking off slower than the theology of migration in quantitative terms. Google Scholar and Web of Science identified only 12 and 8 publications, respectively, with the keywords genetic and human migration in the title between 2000 and 2019. Likewise, these search engines found only 41 and 29 works, respectively, with the keywords DNA and human migration in the title. And these studies were not all focused on human migration. On top of it, there were no publications with gender, DNA, and human migration, and gender, genetics, and human migration in the title in Web of Science. So like in theology of migration, there is a need in this new field of migration research to adapt a gender frame in the analysis, a lens that focuses on relational aspects and moves beyond the mere description of differences between sex categories of male and female. So based on my reviews of transnational migration literature, the gender gaps in this field can be summarized as follows. First, the visibility of women, or for other scholars, the over-visibility of women in migration studies, unintentionally leads to feminized gender in the field, which overlooks other socially constructed categories and the dynamics of power among them. The numerical dominance of migrant men that we observe in present-day migration statistics does not therefore automatically translate into many publications about them compared to research focusing on migrant women. Second, heteronormativity still prevails in migration studies, which slows down the inclusion of sexuality and queer perspectives in migration research. This explains why the voices and experiences of LGBTQ migrants, notably beyond Europe and the US, remain marginal in migration scholarship compared to their heterosexual counterparts. The heteronormative tendency also overlooks the importance of reflexivity work, that is a critical introspection on how the researcher's social identities at the intersection of different categories of difference shape the research process and the relations of power during it. Reflexivity work forms part of the praxis of what feminist epistemologist Donna Haraway calls situated knowledges, which helps researchers illumine the power dynamics that transpires during knowledge production. And third, although the gender and migration scholarship has brought to the fore the analytical effectiveness of a gender approach to migration, its influence has not yet permeated the broader migration studies. We can see that in the case of the theology of migration and the research or migration research in the field of biology. So the reflex of what we call, Pesar and Mahler calls bringing gender in, therefore, unfinished in this field. There are at least 3 factors that I think can explain these gaps, which are not necessarily related to one another. First, since the evolution of broader transnational migration studies is not uniform, so does the gender and migration scholarship across countries and regions. There are still many socio-geographic contexts in the world where gender and migration research is still in its first or second phase of development. Second, the compartmentalized, open quote, nature of social science, close quote, that American sociologist Pierre Hondaño Sotelo identifies engenders compartmentalized migration studies, in which scholars remain working within the frontiers of their disciplines or research areas, with fewer contacts and dialogues or none at all with other scholars outside of their fields. And third, there is also a compartmentalized geography of migration studies, reflecting the so-called global south, global north relations of inequalities. Widely held theoretical perspectives on migration still originate mostly from the so-called global north, and scholars of this region remain numerically dominant in terms of the number of publications or research outputs on human mobility. So the question now is, how can we address the gender gaps in transnational migration studies and other remaining issues in the field? In this concluding part of my lecture, I draw from this article I co-authored in 2017 that proposes 3 ways, which I believe are still applicable to the present state of transnational migration studies. These 3 ways all encourages analytical rigor in migration research. The first way is to, I quote here, analyze the transnational practices and experiences of migrants and their families through an intersectional approach, during which gender is treated not as an isolated category or variable, but instead as a social relationship, entailing a power hierarchy within which gender intersects with other categories of difference. So by doing so, we can avoid feminized gender, that is equating gender with women and vice versa. The second way is to consider the contextuality of intersectional analysis in migration research. As I pointed out in my review of the migration literature associated with social reproduction, transnational spatial mobility has changing value and social meanings at certain points in time in varying social contexts. Temporal and societal context can help us understand why gender intersects with specific categories of difference at a given moment and place, what outcomes this intersection has on individuals, and how these people deal with them. The third way is to pay attention to the issue of simultaneity in analyzing transnational experiences and practices, which are mediated through intersecting social divisions. This suggests the necessity of including at the same time in the analysis the societies in which migrants are enmeshed, or in short, gender geographies of power, in the words of Patricia Pessar and Sarah Mahler. Based on these 3 possible ways to move forward, the lens of transnationalism appears effective to pursue inclusiveness in migration studies, as it compels us to expand our analytical horizon to the societies of origin of migrants, their historical ties, colonial or post-colonial, with migrants receiving countries, the social and legal norms there, and their influence on migrants' lives, positionality, and sense-making. So combining the lens of transnationalism with other analytical approaches, such as intersectionality, makes it powerful to unveil the nuances and subtleties of migrants' experiences. So to address the issues regarding the non-uniform development and compartmentalized characteristics of transnational migration studies, there is a need for immediate transnational collaborative actions to bring the field to the next level that is more diversified, interdisciplinary, and gender sensitive. So these actions will entail cooperation among migration scholars of diverse socio-demographic backgrounds of distinct research fields and disciplines from economically developing and developed countries, as well as at different stages in their research and or academic careers. This can take various forms, such as co-conducting research projects, data sharing and comparison, co-authoring, co-organizing scientific events, or making these events like seminars or conferences easily accessible to researchers with limited or no funding at all, particularly at this time of global pandemic that is worsening social inequalities around the world. So it is through these collaborations that we can avoid methodological nationalism, in the words of Andreas Wimmer and Nina Glick-Schiller, and also impede the perpetuation of what Eleanor Kaufman calls the unequal internationalization of migration studies. It is through collaborative actions that we can reduce inequalities in knowledge production in transnational migration studies. This graduate conference, Neuchâtel Graduate Conference, gathering researchers of different career stages from several countries in the world is, I think, a very good example, a very good starting point to develop such a kind of transnational collaborations and also establish transnational dialogues. So I end here my presentation, and I thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to exchanging with you.
Thank you very much, Asuncion. I will immediately give the floor to Janine for a few comments.
Many thanks, Asuncion, for this interesting talk. And could I ask you to stop sharing your, then I can see you better, which is just nicer. Many thanks. So many thanks for you. I think this was really an interesting talk. And I also think it's extremely valuable, what you did kind of to step back, to make one step back and to look how a field develops. So the way you analyze this data to show, okay, what are actually still these gender gaps within migration studies and how also could we address them? I really think we do not often enough actually to make these stops, to go back and reflect on the field where we are working in. And but my comments or my questions, actually, I think I even go back a step more, and I would like to think or to propose to think about the link between knowledge production within migration studies and what you have been presenting now, basically. Because there are at least three elements which made me puzzle, and I would like just to shortly elaborate on these three elements which I really found interesting. Not, it goes beyond, or maybe I could say I would like to propose that we should think about why did this field develop the way you described it. So you really described very nicely how it developed, how we could address these gaps. But for me, the question is, why did it develop this way and not differently? The first point is that starting from your observation that we still have gender gaps, so it's not an unfinished issue within migration study, not only an unfinished issue within migration study. I was also wondering about this time lap in terms of when all these theoretical ideas have been brought up in view of gender and sexuality studies, and when they entered migration studies. Let me give you some examples. Like in social science, I think in most of the disciplines, it was in the 60s or 70s that we had this debate about male bias, and within all these disciplines have been this attempt to visibilize women, kind of. So that's what we later called women's studies. In migration studies, this was in the 80s, 10 years later, and we even find it today, this kind of women's studies, which within the disciplines actually belongs to the history of gender studies. It's not done anymore. In the 1980s, we had this distinction between sex and gender, gender as a social construction, gender as a relational concept, as an analytical matrix, how to understand labor markets, ideologies, power relations, etc. In migration studies, as you showed us, this was in the 2000s that basically these ideas entered with a focus on care and also a bias toward family migration. So 20 years later, queer studies emerged in the 90s with Judith Butler and many others. We had these ideas about performativity of gender, sexualities, the social construction of biology, which kind of swept over all the social science discipline. In migration studies, we had two maybe articles in, let's say, 15 years later, and it's now that this topic actually is worked on within migration studies. Or a last example, we had in the 80s or 90s, you didn't pick up on this, but I think it's important, an important critique of women of color or women from the global south towards ethnocentric and Eurocentric and racist feminism from white middle-class European women. This also now is picked up in migration studies, and we have all these debates about how to include global south and how can we include the other gender and sexuality perspective, etc. So my first question, which is really puzzling me, is why why this time lap actually? Well, one could say, okay, migration studies as a quasi-discipline does only exist since maybe 2 or 3 decades, and of course it comes late. But I don't think that this argument is valuable, because gender studies as a discipline is not much older. I mean, gender studies or sexuality, queer studies have been developed within the discipline, and since maybe 10, 15 years in Europe, you have chairs for gender studies, sexuality studies. So for me, the question remains, why did these theoretical orientations have not been anchored and embedded in migration studies at the same time as in other disciplines? And you gave the answer, well, it was very much compartmentalized, but I'm not sure, because when it comes to knowledge production, why is it that in migration studies, this form of power and inequalities did not count? We had a lot of work about social inequalities, socioeconomic inequalities, like social class was very important at the beginning of migration studies. But why gender and sexuality didn't appear? So, I mean, obviously I can develop some ideas about it was mainly in Europe, white men who defined the canon, etc. But it's too easy. I think it's more complex. Or is it because migration studies was so closely linked to commissioned research, and hence so politically involved and reproducing normative and political categories, and in this sense reproduced also kind of hegemonic structure of dominance, also regarding gender and sexualities? Well, you might have some other ideas, but I found this quite puzzling, actually. And my second question, I will be short to now, is why now? There is without doubt, and at least I observed this, an enhanced interest within migration studies now, these last 10 years, and you showed this on behalf of your data, and your work is also witnessing this, that we have this interest for gender and sexuality issues and studies within migration studies. We had just recently this Palgrave Handbook of Gender and Migration. So there are really important work now published. So why is it now? Is it because of the social movements we have, like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, climatic change, etc.? Is it just a question of generation? Or is it maybe also that we didn't have a kind of activism within migration studies? I already talked about this morning in this exchange with younger scholars. I mean, gender studies, it was from the beginning linked to feminist and queer activism. And there was lobbying and there was a politicization. Migration studies, we had feminists and also queer activists, but no migration scholars who have been feminist or queer, if you would like to. And now, for the first time, I think we have migrantized and racialized queer and feminist and LGBTQ plus scholars entering the field, and maybe also a kind of activism which is developing. So this is one hypothesis, but why now this interest for these issues? I really think in terms of knowledge production, this is interesting. It's an interesting question to ask. And third, I was also thinking maybe we should also scrutinize what is migration studies, actually? Because I think there is a lot going on in terms of gender and sexuality studies in fields which overlap with migration studies, but which is done by scholars who would not call themselves migration scholars. So I wouldn't call myself a migration scholar either, by the way. And so I think particularly of the field like critical race studies, which is linked to migration studies, and where gender and sexuality is absolutely crucial. You have, of course, queer study scholars who work on migration, but wouldn't appear in this field of transnational gender and migration as you try to identify it. You have a lot of nationalism scholars. There's a lot of literature about the role of gender and sexuality for nation building. And of course, it's also related to migration or citizenship studies. So just some of this field. So for me, the question is really, is migration studies the field where this couldn't be anchored, whereas in all the other fields, we have this gender gaps much less or less pronounced until today? And if so, why is it like this? I mean, I'm really puzzled by this. So thanks you again for your really very insightful talk. And I think there will be many other questions, but I was really puzzled by this knowledge production issue.
Thank you very much, Janine, for these intellectually stimulating questions. When I was doing or carrying out this review, quantitative and qualitative, I have actually the same questions in my mind. How come it's like this? How could I explain this quantitative data that I saw in these two search engines with my knowledge from qualitative review of migration research? So I will also maybe propose some hypotheses because I don't have concrete data about that. So why this time left? I do agree with your first hypothesis about the commissioned research. This morning I had lecturing about migration and gender research also, and there was this question about why gender just came very late in migration studies, why not before? So I answered that by looking at also the strong impact of state policies on receiving and sending countries, actually migration policies, which are mostly anchored on heteronormative norms, like why we started studying queer migrants, for example, in Europe, in the US, just now, while in Asia, we are not yet studying LGBTQ migrants' rights because the gender norms there maybe impede scholars to work on that. But also, we need also to look at the developments in the areas of migration policies touching the lives of this type of people, because migration scholars usually, like us, we tend to examine how state institutions like the state impact the lives of migrants. So when we look at state policies on migration and they are anchored on heteronormative notions of what is ideal family or ideal couple, ideal migrant women, ideal men, so we could trace that most of these policies are really heteronormative. So we follow this kind of trend by looking at, okay, for example, in the case of Filipino migrants, I was studying in the Belgian context right now to be able to justify well scientifically my focus on these women. I look at the statistics and justifying that, oh, in Belgium, there are more Filipino migrant women. So this support my argument that it's really heuristic to understand and study these women, and looking at also the demand in the labor markets, which are mostly influenced also by this kind of heteronormative conceptions of who are the right workers to do, for example, care work within households in different institutions. So, okay, migrant women from developing countries. So I think we could maybe answer that question by looking at more closely at the series of developments in the areas of policies, how the state also deals with the issues of migration. And then the second question, about gender and sexuality, why is it now? I think I also agree with your hypothesis that these social movements about Me Too movements, Black Lives Matters also have an impact on the way migration scholars choose their research topic, research focus. And for example, in Europe, we tend to focus now on the lives of minorities more and more, like from, how can I say, former colonies in Africa or from Southeast Asia, because there is this increasing consciousness that we need to diversify the voices of people we are studying. So I think social movements have also impact on the way we chose research topics and, of course, analytical lenses. The question about what is migration studies, that is a big question. I could not give an exact definition because as what I observe is that migration itself has different meaning in different social contexts, in different countries, in different regions. And yeah, there are a lot of theories about it in the past. We all know that, classical theories, many typologies, internal migration, international migration, etc. So I think the disciplinary divide, what I mentioned a while ago about compartmentalization, compartmentalized nature of social science, has a lot of impact on this. Why in other areas of research, gender, for example, has been already well adapted, while in other areas of migration studies is not yet, is because maybe scholars in particular discipline, like in sociology of migration or anthropology of migration, they are more like active in adapting this kind of lens, while in other disciplines, maybe in history or in other areas, research areas, they tend to prioritize other categories of difference. And without dialogues, as what I identify in my review, without collaborations among these researchers, we could not, we could not address this kind of gap. It's only when, for example, we try to make a holistic review of the literature that we could see this kind of tendency, like, oh my God, in theology, there have also a lot of works on migrant women, refugees. And I came to know that when one time they, some theologians or scholars of theology of migration invited me in one conference, and I was like so surprised. How come I did not know about this? So I think it's the question now, why I'm not aware of what is going on in the other areas. And until one time you will be invited to such kind of event, or one maybe a young researcher contact you from other disciplines. Oh, I came across with your work. I'm actually doing other research in biology, but it's about migration. Oh, I did not know that you are applying DNA analysis. So this kind of thing. So I think like as what I proposed in the last part of my presentation is we need more dialogues. I don't know now how to approach this. How could we establish dialogues among different scholars studying migration or mobility, spatial mobility of people, objects, and also try to understand or to know what analytical lens in other disciplines they are using to analyze the same phenomenon that we are looking. It's like we have different lenses, but we are looking at the same object. So maybe by sharing among us these lenses and try to use the lens from other disciplines, we could also maybe come up with a holistic definition of what is migration studies. Yeah, I hope I answered your question. Thank you, Janine.
Thank you so much to Janine and for her thoughtful comments and for your reaction, Asuncion. I think now I will open the floor to other questions from the audience. You can raise your hands, your virtual hands, or put them in the chat if you don't want to appear on the camera. But I have one first question by Laxmi Dunjel. Okay. If you want, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity, and then congratulations that I got lots of information about gender into the migration study. So I'm not going to ask the question, but I'm only here to bring my study here. So while I was also doing my PhD, the initial stage, I was also too much worried about how to bring this gender dimension into my study. So I did study about the returnee migrants, which I have also presented today in this conference. I bring the issues of the returnees women into the Nepali society, how they are integrating into the society. So what changes or what contribution they are expecting to bring into the society. So at that initial stage, I was also too much worried to bring gender into the migration studies. So my professors also were saying that your study seems like it is like mentioned the woman studies, but again I brought the gender into the analysis, like as you mentioned, Malar and Persus about the gender, geography and power, how it works into the transnational context. Later on I brought that the concept of mobilities, and then the concept of gender into the migration studies. So I think what you are bringing is very much relevant into the present context to bring the issues of the female into the society, how they are going to do they are struggling into this kind of gender structure. And then bringing the transnational schooling or skills, and then their education into their national context, and then negotiating for the gender roles. So the gender roles into the home is totally different, where certain kind of stratified, and then certain kind of expectations, cultural barrier are there, and then these certain kind of skills or knowledge, basically the migrants get into their host countries. So while bringing those kind of things into the home country, so there needs certain kind of negotiation. That is the basic work I also engaged with, certain kind of mobility, gendered. And then before, the migration was only perceived as a push and pull factor, but now we need to bring certain kind of aspirations, issues of the gender into the migration study. So into our Asian or the Nepali context, it is relevant, I think. So and talking about the intersectionality into the migration, as you mentioned, in Asian context or in Nepali context also, we are lacking this kind of studies. And then people are bringing, or the societies are not that much accepting of the identities of the people. So while I was teaching to my students also, they have raised that while we understand gender, we only understand the male and female, why not bringing the other aspect, like issues of the LGBTQs, and then queer, and then into the mobilities. Well, while we talk about the mobilities, it is too much like restrictions, and then societies also, while they come out, they are bullying. So that issues are there, but it is not brought into the research. So how we can bring this kind of phenomenon into our context is very much important. And then my question is like, how to bring those kind of issues into our social context, which is not that much friendly with these LGBTQs and then intersectionalities issues. So that is my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laxmi. That is a very interesting question about how to bring LGBTQ migrants in research as a research focus in a country where, gender and migration research is not yet developed. So I think like the good starting point is really to focus on power relations instead of, for example, directly focusing on individuals, because I think like if you look at power relations in the context of migration and you become interested in the case of minorities, migrant minorities, then you could, I think, bring to the research focus the case of LGBTQ migrants, and you can even compare with the case of minority women in the context of migration. Of course, it's not so easy, particularly when you are starting in this field. It is so broad and you need to learn many concepts, theoretical approaches, and also we also need to counter the trend in our own countries where we are doing the research, the trend in migration research. So each country, like as you said, in Nepal, gender and migration research is not yet developed, but in other Asian countries, like in East Asia, in Japan, South Korea, and also Southeast Asian countries, in Thailand and the Philippines, gender and migration research has been developing strongly for the last decades. So I think like, looking at power relations in the context of migration is the first, how can I say, an effective step towards including LGBTQ migrants, not only minority women, in the analysis. And also based on my own experience, like teaching migration and gender to master level students, there is always this kind of, how can I say, belief that when I will study women, I am doing a gender and migration research. And I always need to explain to them, no, it doesn't mean that you are working on women. your research will be like categorized as in gender and migration research. You really need to pay attention to these power dynamics, asymmetric relationship hierarchies fashioned by gender identities or gender norms in the country of origin or the country of destinations of the migrants you would like to study. It's not the persons, the people that you are focusing on that will make or will make your research gender informed. So this is not automatic for young researchers, but I think we need to keep in mind, okay, gender is not about women and women is not about gender. We can also study men using gender lens or study gender through the case of migrant men and of course other minorities like LGBTQ migrants. So I hope I answered your question, Laxmi, and you can also contact me by email if you have further questions. I'll be glad to reply to your questions.
I would like to thank you very much, Asuncion, for this rich presentation on a very important topic, and also to Janine for her thoughtful comments and well-informed. As always, thank you very much to both of you for this conference. As mentioned at the beginning, this conference was recorded, so we will upload it on our YouTube channel. And this was the closing events of our conference. So let me just finish by saying again a huge thanks to the members of the organizing team, to the senior scholars of our NCCR on the Move, of our international advisory boards, and to external scholars who have participated in this event. A warm thanks goes also to my dear colleagues of the Network Office, also to Pauline Lecomte and Jeremy for their technical support, and of course to all the participants who have presented great papers throughout the conference. So thank you very much to all of you. This event would never exist without you. And last but not least, I would like to invite you to save the date for the 5th edition of the Neuchâtel Graduate Conference, which will take place on the 7th and 8th of July 2022. And this time we hope that we can invite you by the Lake of Neuchâtel for a wonderful conference. So thank you very much and bye-bye.